Good evening. Such is the seriousness of the hurricane danger bearing down on America that President Bush is planning to spend tonight at the headquarters of U.S. Northern Command in Colorado Springs. That's the sort of place a president might go in the event of World War III, and a sign that no one intends to repeat the mistakes of Hurricane Katrina. Meanwhile, the G7 industrial countries are so alarmed, they announced tonight they are to send a delegation to oil producers to try to secure supplies. The best predictions are that Hurricane Rita will hit the coast of Texas and Louisiana within the next few hours. The eye of the storm is expected to arrive at the coastal city of Port Arthur. The authorities in Texas said today they expect the entire city to be flooded, and it's believed that Rita will strike a 400-mile wide belt of the United States. This has been a wretched day already for anyone in the area.
Good morning, America. I'm Charles Gibson. This morning in Houston, an area all along the Texas Gulf Coast bracing for Hurricane Rita. Bracing in Texas and bracing in Louisiana as well. As if Texas didn't have enough problems, there is now a bus fire that has shut down the northbound lanes of Interstate 45, which is the main evacuation route from Houston up to Dallas.
If some people insist on staying and believe that they can weather this kind of storm, that perhaps they should write their Social Security numbers on their arms with indelible ink.
Yeah, those people need to get out because that tide's about to collapse. Now you're going to have a rush of water, and this is a situation, and I can't control these people.
And the rain is beginning to pick up here in New Orleans, which is already under a tropical storm warning. They say the wind is blowing about 30 to 40 miles an hour. I have to hold on to this rope to keep from getting blown off this roof.
We're looking at households affected, 1.8 million. Residents destroyed, about 6,000. The emergency debris alone that will be generated by this storm is about 27 million tons.
I'm joined now by Matt Fry, who's in Houston. Matt, how has this evacuation gone?
Well, I mean, it is the biggest evacuation in U.S. history. Remember, Gavin, this is a city of 4 million inhabitants. I'm talking about the Houston area. And although there was no mandatory evacuation, as far as we can tell, practically everyone has left the city. And that's why you had these incredible scenes on the interstates heading out of town of tens of thousands of cars stuck in gridlock, unable to drive because they've run out of petrol. Because apart from anything else, it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, so if you've got your air conditioning on, that will make the car run out of petrol quicker. One thing after another has mitigated towards making this mass evacuation the biggest logjam in history, and for many people, a bit of a disaster. But then at the same time, this is a very big country with very big cars and very big weather.
How bad do people expect Hurricane Rita will be when it finally does make land?
I couldn't hear your question, Gavin.
How bad do people think Hurricane Rita will be when it makes landfall?
Well, as you can see, the wind is picking up already. In about 7 hours from now, we'll have our rendezvous with Rita, and it will be a bad storm. It's been downgraded to a Category 3, but that still means it can pack winds of 125 miles or so. And crucially, because it's quite a slow-moving storm, they think that those winds will ravage this area for up to 12 hours. So there will be quite a lot of damage. A small item of good news for Houston, and that is that the eye of the storm does seem to have veered a little bit towards the east in the last few hours, and that means that the oil cities of Beaumont and Port Arthur are going to be directly in the line of fire. And those two cities together have a population of about 170,000. Again, most of those people have been evacuated, but that is the hub of the Texas oil industry. In fact, the oil industry in Texas started in Beaumont about 100 years ago.
And of course, George Bush used to be governor of Texas. Do we expect there to be more signs of joined-up government this time rather than there was over Hurricane Katrina?
Well, if I can hear you correctly, what's really been interesting, Gavin, in the last few days is how they have made a big effort from the top to the bottom of the tree to try and coordinate the various agencies of government which proved to be so dysfunctional during Katrina. I think that has now worked quite well. It's partly because the president has pushed the right buttons, he screamed at the right people. There was an interesting moment today when he said, I'm going to go and see the disaster zone before the storm has even hit. And then someone suggested, well, perhaps you might get in the way. And then the White House, oddly enough, changed its mind. So perhaps they're a little bit wobbly on one or two issues. But overall, the impression is that they are in charge and that they are coordinating with all the other agencies, not just FEMA, Homeland Security, of course, but also the agencies on a state level and on a local level. And then, of course, there's the Texas factor. Texas is, after all, George Bush's home turf. He knows the people here extremely well, and they have done their best to make the best out of this situation. But then remember those extraordinary scenes of logjam. There's only so much you can do when everyone wants to get out of their hometown in their own car.
Matt, thanks very much for joining us from Houston. Well, the city of Houston is America's oil capital, and as we saw with the hurricane which hit New Orleans, all along the Texas and Louisiana coast there are refineries and oil installations. Tonight, the G7 industrialized countries said they would send a delegation to all oil-producing countries to try to get a grip on supplies. Katrina and Rita have pointed to the obvious fragility of the oil industry, threatened by hurricanes, a lack of refining capacity, and by political instability from Venezuela to Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. Liz McKean reports.
This time, the Gulf of Mexico is prepared. The mass evacuation of its residents is continuing, even as the first rains of Hurricane Rita draw ever closer. President Bush, ahead of the hurricane this time, was there to support the effort. He's faced weeks of criticism for responding too slowly to Hurricane Katrina and is evidently feeling defensive.
There will be no risk of me getting in the way, I promise you. We're going to make sure that we're not in the way of the operations. What I am going to do is observe the relationship between the state and local government.
While people may be spared, the industries they leave behind will take the full force of the weather. It's already severely disrupted oil refining, needed to make the fuel that is now powering this escape. The path of Rita and Katrina is the heartland of the US oil refining industry. The state of Louisiana provides 3 million barrels a day of refined petroleum, with Texas accounting for a further 5 million barrels. Of that, almost a third has been halted by the two hurricanes. Before Rita has even hit land, 3.4 million barrels a day have been lost. In all, 30% of US refining capacity has been taken out. At least the hurricane season comes and goes, but as every motorist is discovering, high oil prices look set to continue, and it's not just because of surging demand. Oil-producing countries are willing to make more available. The supplies are out there. The trouble is the capacity to refine it is not. Saudi Arabia may be considered politically fraught, but it is offering to produce extra oil to help bring down prices. But Saudi oil, heavy and sulfurous, takes a lot more refining, adding to the shortage in capacity.
Because the extra supply tends to come from the Middle East and that trend looks set to grow, there is a very real interest at the moment in whether people have invested enough in the refining sector to be able to meet product demand from the increasingly heavy, higher sulfur crudes that are available in the market.
The world's oil refineries are concentrated in the industrial centres of Asia, North America and Western Europe, totalling 735 refineries. A much higher proportion of the light fuels needed for planes and cars are processed in North America. Outside the US, most of the refineries lack the capacity or ability to refine those key products from the heavy Gulf crude oils that are readily available. The industries that rely on the lighter crude products are dismayed by the rise in prices that have seen the cost of fuel treble in the last 2 years. The head of the Virgin Group says up to 20 more refineries are needed to keep the modern world turning.
If you just take Virgin Atlantic and Virgin Trains together, we're talking about spending about £300 to £400 million more on fuel than we were 2 years ago. Inevitably, that will mean higher fares, and therefore the only way of actually avoiding this getting out of control and fuel prices, going up, doubling yet again, is to try to get more refining capacity and try to get more people to build refining capacity.
But who should pay for it? The question has stifled new investment. Should it be the oil industry, basking in record high prices, or the consuming countries that are being hit by them?
We have to explain to the general public that you cannot have petrol if you don't have refineries. So refineries are needed. And one of the major difficulties, at least in our developed countries, to build new refineries is that there is the so-called NIMBY effect, not in my backyard. People are very happy with new refineries, provided that it is far from their houses.
But the available supplies coincide with some of the world's most unstable regions, the Gulf and Nigeria, where a US oil company today closed a second platform after it was targeted by activists. The IMF has warned this week that disruption to supplies, rather than growing demand, is posing the greatest threat to the future world economy.
In effect, this is our lifeline, and therefore any group hostile to our interests has become increasingly aware that they can stand on this lifeline. This, after all, is what people like Al-Qaeda are actively trying to do. So far they've been largely thwarted, but certainly their intention is to blackmail us in that way.
The platforms on the Gulf of Mexico are deserted this evening in anticipation of the worst. Normal service should soon be resumed. But the way the hurricanes have caused so much disruption to the oil supply is an ominous sign for analysts of how fragile the industry was in the first place.
Liz McKean. I'm joined now by George Monbiot, who's a writer and campaigner on environmental issues, and by Robin West, who's an advisor to the US Secretary for Energy. Mr. Monbiot, first of all, how worried should we be about the specific question of oil refineries, lack of?
Well, clearly there's a lack of capacity. Just last week, OPEC released an extra 2 million barrels a day onto the market, but of the wrong kind of oil, of the kind of oil which the refineries are not equipped to deal with. It's the heavy sulfurous oil we heard about in that package, rather than the light sweet crude which those refineries can handle. Underlying that is the idea that there isn't enough light sweet crude around in the first place.
Are you in the odd position for an environmental campaigner wanting to build more oil refineries then?
No.
Not that far.
Not that far. I mean, if you want to secure your supplies of energy, by far the quickest and most effective way of doing it is to reduce demand rather than find new supply, because that means you need far less supply. That means you need rely far less on insecure parts of the world.
Mr. West, in Washington, how worried are you about the lack of capacity at refineries?
Oh, I think people in America are very concerned on this refining issue. And Katrina, the market was already very tight, and then Katrina pushed it over, and then Rita pushed it over even further.
But
it's on everyone's mind.
But is there a free market solution to what you suggest is perhaps a free market problem? In other words, you can't build these things overnight, can you?
Well, I think one of the things the government can get out of the way and be helpful. It's been virtually impossible in the United States to build a refinery simply because of all the permits. You just couldn't get them built.
How worried are you about the other question, which is, if, as an American, if you look at where you get a lot of your oil, you're looking at places like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria and so on, which are potentially or actively politically unstable?
I think people are very concerned about this. I think we're entering a new age. We define energy security as reliable supply at reasonable cost. We're now entering the era of energy insecurity, where we have unreliable supply at unreasonable